How hard is it to insert false memories?
Not hard.
Mm.
It's very easy to distort memories or to insert small false memories. It's harder to convince people of entire events, especially specific events. And this is widely debated, exactly how easy it is to implant a specific false memory. It's also one of the big debates around my own research, is that when I was writing The Memory Illusion, which was my first book, and the research that was in line with that, there was this huge debate between me and a couple of other academics about what it means for something to be a false memory and how we should talk about the ease with which they're implanted. And that is still one of the biggest scientific debates in our field. And to me, I think that's so the coding stuff is about the difference between what some people call a false belief and a false memory. So I think this thing happened, or I remember this thing happened. And that is a really difficult differentiation often, because all we have as social psychologists is what you're telling me. And I can ask you, do you think it really happened or not? Do you believe it really happened? But it's really hard to differentiate. And so I've always thought that you need to ask people about the specifics, like how confident are you in this memory? Do you feel things in this memory? Does it feel like other kinds of memory, right? Sort of describe the nature of this experience rather than being like, do you think this is a real memory? Because that's a hard thing to ask people to do.
So you want to get indirectly as many signals as possible to show that they actually believe the thing happened.
Or that it approximates a memory in their minds. That's right. Rather than just a thing they think kind of sort of happened.
Yeah.
But other people think that it's an easier to differentiate line. So for me, that it's almost impossible to differentiate the two. Other people think it's more clear. And then in terms of the frequency, so in my research, 70% of people became convinced that they committed a crime that never happened or experienced another important emotional event. And that number as well is challenged in that people go, well, does that mean that 70% of people can have false memories like this? And the answer is no, obviously not. That's just in my sample. That's just these specific 6 false memories. And it could be that I think 100% of people are prone to some version of this, just maybe not in this specific study, right? If I had to come up with different false memories to implant, or if I was a different person myself and people trusted me differently. There's, again, those social factors that make it more or less likely that I'm going to be able to convince you that something happened in your life that you can't remember. And in one study, obviously, I can't capture that. But it also doesn't mean that 70% of the time people are, it might be 1% of the time or 0.1% of the time that people have these complex false memories.
I guess you're just speaking to the fact that, you don't know how representative the sample is. But even with one study, that's a crazy, that's incredible.
Well, it's not just representativeness. It's also that we shouldn't take individual studies in that way.
Sure.
Like, I'm not saying that 70% of people always have false memories either. Like, it just means in this one study, more people than not develop these complex memories.
What was the methodology for implanting the false memories? This is so cool, by the way. Human memory is so fascinating. And the fact that we can engineer memory.
It's good.
So
and it's
interesting. Bad. It's also really interesting that we live so much of our lives in memories.
Mm.
And that you can mess with that. You can shape it. It's interesting.
It's mostly, I think, a good thing that we can shape it.
I think so.
Yeah. I think the fact that memory can be false in the way that I do it in my study it's a result of the fact that our minds are made to creatively recombine information to solve problems in the present. And so even the fact that we have this gist memory, it's because we're optimizing data processing. We're basically saying these are the most important things from these events. And the other details are irrelevant. Don't remember that. Gone. And now I'm going to work with that to try and solve what life comes up with. And the ability to be creative and intelligent relies on our ability to take memories from the past and pieces of them and to creatively recombine them. And so that's what false memories are, except that then can look bad if you're trying to remember something specific. And so in my research, I used leading and suggestive questions like close your eyes, picture the event that I'm trying to implant. So I was implanting, for example, you're 14 years old, you were in contact with the police called your parents, and you assaulted someone with a weapon. And then the question is, what do you remember? And you say to me as a participant, because you've been selected out to specifically never having had this experience. And just to be clear, a weapon, I don't mean a semi-automatic weapon. I mean anything. And usually it was a rock. And so people would say I found, because a weapon is just anything you use to hurt another person. And I did the study in Canada. We don't have guns in the same way as in some other parts of the world. And so it was unlikely that my participants would have been like, yeah, I totally have all these guns. And so they would take something, an object, and hurt somebody else, or they stole something, or they hit somebody. So those are 3 of the conditions. And I randomly assigned people to them. And they knew that I'd contacted their loved ones ahead of time. So they were participating in a childhood memory study, an emotional childhood memory study, and they knew that. And then I'd contacted their parents ahead of time to get information about what they were like as teenagers, where they lived, friends, basic things, and to make sure they hadn't ever experienced any of the target events. Mm-hmm. And then with that information, I said to the participants, okay, so there's these 2 things your parents reported happening, and one of them is a true one. And so I'd always include a true one to build rapport, which is I'm doing the what not to do of interviewing, right?
Right.
I'm laying it on thick.
To see what's possible.
To see what's possible, because you have to push it to also show that that I can do this in this context so that we can warn police to not do this. So I said, we had these 2 incidents that your parents reported, and one of them was you had a skiing accident and blah, blah, blah. Let's start with that one. The second one was an incident where you were in contact with the police, but we'll get to that. So we'd first have 20 minutes talking about the true memory, which people, they're getting going. It feels good. I've got a structured interview as well, which I'll then mirror in the false memory. So it all feels very legit. And then we get to the second memory, and I say this, there's this other important memory that your parents recalled. And then they'd say, I don't remember that. And I'd say, oh, okay, but I have this really detailed account. All you have to do is remember it. And then I would do the illusion of transparency, which is a really powerful psychological tool, which is to make people feel like they know what's going on when they don't really. And the thing I would do is just say, well, if you want to, we can do this memory retrieval technique called this imagination exercise. And I don't like to call it repression, but sometimes we hide away memories that we don't like about ourselves. And I'm using words that people know and mechanisms that people have heard of that are, frankly, quite disputed in actual science. But people go, oh, well, maybe I did repress this. And then everybody says yes. Like, technically, they could say no. They could say, no, I don't want to do that. But they go, yeah, of course I want to know. And so I do this imagination exercise where people close their eyes, very simple, and just imagine what could have happened, basically. And every time they say a detail, my very first detail ever, I remember this because I was so excited because they've got their eyes closed, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm right next to the head of department because they were worried, because I was a PhD student, that, the ethics of it, the consequences, like it took years to get the protocol through ethics and to make sure it was safe. Anyway, I'm grinning as the person with their eyes closed says the most trivial detail. I remember a blue sky. Mm-hmm. And I remember going, it's working.
Did you know what's going to happen at all?
Oh, no, I had no idea.
That's so fascinating.
And so from the trivial details, and I'd always say, yeah, good job. Mm-hmm. Social reinforcement, little treat. And they would remember more and more details, and then they get more specific. And then they tell me who it was they allegedly attacked or stole from, where they were. And those details had to come from them because I don't know enough about their lives, right? So this is the other thing with false memories, is it's basing it on lots of real pieces of memories, real places, real people, real feelings. They're just woven together in a way that never happened. And so just 3 interviews, and you've got 70% of people confessing to a crime that never happened.
First of all, great study. Great job all around. To what degree has this been sort of elaborated on and proven further since? This is a super powerful idea, whether it's 70% or any kind of percent.
What I wanted with the study is just to show it's possible.
That's really the powerful thing, that it's possible.
Right. And so it could have been 2 people and I would have been happy. The fact that it was so possible was, frankly, quite surprising to everybody. And we did, in fact, cut the study short because we told ethics that we're only going to have like a 13% hit rate. And we're like, oh, this is working really well. We're going to stop.
Yeah.
And that was just because of, how power calculations, whatever, science, because science. And since then, there have been other studies on implanting false memories. There have been ones also using AI tools. So like whether or not we remember or think we remember incidents differently or better if they were created with AI images of ourselves or videos. So there was a study that came out, I think it was this year, by a team including Elizabeth Loftus, which showed that if you turn photos of yourself into videos using AI, that you are more likely to believe that those things happened in the way that AI is telling you that they did, even though AI has absolutely no idea. And that then you are more likely to remember it with high confidence that it happened in the way that this AI has created it. And so we can see that there's lots of versions of this, whether it's in interpersonal social interactions or interactions with tech. And there's a big replication that's happening right now at the University of Maastricht of my study, or is about to happen. Hopefully, actually, is where we're at.
There's a lot of questions I want to ask here. One of them, doesn't this mean that at scale you can have something like a government use propaganda to mass gaslight a population? So implant false memories, using AI, using whatever tools they have.
Yes, that is definitely already happening.
That's terrifying. Is there anything you've learned about defending against that?
Yeah.
I guess knowing that first step is just knowing that it's possible. That's already a very powerful piece of knowledge.
That's right. So the first thing that's important is for people to understand that they are capable of creating these false memories and that they're not this really unusual, hard to generate thing, that they're actually a normal memory process. And that insight is why I wrote The Memory Illusion, is because I think people need to just understand that their minds work like this and that they're really glitchy when it comes to the accuracy of their autobiographical memories. But again, that's probably ultimately a good thing as well in terms of our overall human experience. But then what happens if you do have an important piece of information that's important to not being distorted, right? You are a witness of a crime, for example, and you now know that this is going to be important. What do you do? And the really simple answer is don't trust your brain. Just make sure you write it down. Assume you are going to forget everything. Assume you're going to forget no matter how important, how emotional, how intense, how much you say to yourself. This is a failure of prospective memory, it's called. I will remember. You won't. Just assume that you're not going to remember. And the closer you get to the time at which an event happened, and we call this contemporaneous evidence, the closer you get in time, the more high quality that memory is going to be. And I think there's this myth sometimes that like if you're drunk or if you're high or if you're really emotional, that's somehow you should wait. You should sort of like go home, sleep it off, and then recall your memory. That is not what the current advice in memory research actually says. It's in the moment, as soon as possible, write it down, record it outside your brain. You can do it again when you wake up, but then at least you have an original version.
Yeah, you use the analogy of a Wikipedia page for memory. I think it's a pretty useful way to think about it. It's kind of crowdsourced by all the different influences you have, all the different experiences, all the other people, you telling other people about the memory, that interact, all of that edits the page, the Wikipedia page of your memory.
It does, and collective and individual memory are these really interesting. They interact in a really interesting way. So I would always say, so when I train, for example, people who go to deal with warlords in the German military, I was working with agents who are going abroad and who are in these really difficult situations where they had to remember a lot of information that was important for national security. They couldn't just sit there with a tape recorder being like, hey, or like their phone being like, hey, Mr. Warlord, can you just talk into this a bit closer? You can't do that. And so you have to remember it. And so what they were doing is they were coming back from their deployments and they would meet up immediately and have like a team meeting to be like, what did you remember? What happened? And the problem is that they would do that before writing their notes. And that is the wrong way around. And so they don't do that anymore because I've told them not to do that anymore. But it feels good. It feels like collectively we are going to remember more details because you do, but it doesn't mean that those details are right. And so that's where I'd always say, have your own version before you talk to anybody. Then, and my colleague, Dr. Annelies Vredeveld, is one of the experts on the effect of things like eye closure on memory and collective memory. And she has found repeatedly that if you remember things together, especially if you've already got an original version of your own, you do usually remember more details. And especially if you are helping each other to remember, like in a relationship, you'll have someone who's better at remembering certain kinds of details, maybe names or what happened or what you were doing, and the other person's better at when it happened. And so you can have these complementary memories that come in social situations, and you can then have more details that are remembered after.
Right, but there's conflicting forces here, so that's true, but also, as you said, it's true that together you can weave a narrative that never happened. So together you can solidify the thing that actually happened, maybe if you take notes beforehand. But at the same time, if you don't take notes, you can just make shit up very effectively together because you're like yes-anding the whole time, like building together a castle that's false,
Or distorted.
distorted.
Yeah. But you can also sometimes go back to your original account and go, actually, no, that was a bit wrong. And so my, as again, an analytical person and someone who works as an expert witness on memory cases, I just want to see all the versions. I want your version history. I want the complete version history of your memory. And then I can tell you whether I think things have gone wrong here. And if so, why?
Have you seen like different versions of memory and they're really conflicting?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what have you learned about memory from that? That they could be very conflicting. People explaining the same experience and it's very different.
Well, there's different people having very different memories of the same experience. And there's the same person having different memories of the same experience. And so I work in both in some ways as an expert witness, but mostly in the individual changing their story in a dramatic way.
Ah,
And
yeah.
so a witness or an alleged victim saying that they, having X story the first time they go to the police, and then 3 years later having a very different, sometimes categorically different account. And the question is, were they just too shy initially to say what really happened? Were they under pressure from other people? Were they not really remembering? Why has it changed? Or could it be that they have been undergone some really problematic like hypnotherapy or just shady therapy in general that has like convinced them that things are maybe much worse than they initially remembered? And it's not that therapy doesn't therapy can bring out more details for sure. But the problem is that certain kinds of therapy mirror what we do in false memory research in terms of implanting false memories. And it just makes it really messy. And it makes the quality of the evidence really low because we can no longer tell what is because of the therapy and what's actually remembered.
This is so fascinating. What are the ways you can possibly figure out which is true? The thing you remembered initially or the thing you're now remembering 4 years later?
Receipts. That's all you got. You have to look at your original versions. If you only have your version now, the only thing you can look for is evidence that confirms or shows that it didn't happen. If you can't access that, then it ultimately is a matter of, especially if you've got like two people saying completely different things, it ends up being a battle of confidence ultimately.
This is a tricky question, but you mentioned therapy. It does seem like what therapists do is they want to find a problem and they can then just project the problem and then convince you the problem existed. So how do you know? Is like therapy even an effective? It takes a very special therapist not to implant, right? A trauma that never happened or details that never happened to a trauma that did.
It depends on the kind of therapy. So there's a lot of therapy that is evidence-based and that is very much focused on tackling sort of feelings and reactions that you have right now. Then there is an area or a bunch of areas of therapy, including psychoanalysis, which are very focused on trying to find retroactively sources of mental illness in your personal past. And I am very critical of the kinds of, well, both from an explanatory perspective, but also from a false memory perspective. I don't think that we are the way we are because of individual incidents that happen to us. I think that is a wild thing to think about the brain. Like to be like, you are the way you are because of this one interaction you had that one time is like, I mean, maybe this explains a tiny bit of you, but what about all the other life experiences you have every single day? And so I think that there's sometimes an oversimplified searching for answers or sources of problems that we have that I don't like. I don't think it's true. And I think that there can be an uncautious approach to memory, as you were saying, where you have someone who is saying things and your role as a therapist is to help them manage their emotions now and to feel better. And that's the other thing is that they have a very different role than I do. The therapist is trying to manage the person's well-being now.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I'm looking at the evidentiary quality. That is I'm almost like, not quite the other side, but I'm in a very different role.
You just want the truth.
Well, I'm criticizing / analyzing their memories, whereas the therapists are more likely to be trying to help them manage the memories in their day-to-day life. And so it doesn't matter if they're true or not to therapists. What matters is that they're troubling to the people themselves. But once you get into a courtroom setting, as you say, the
Mm-hmm.
facts and what actually happened matter. And it's not just what you remember, it's what actually happened.
Maybe you can speak to the non-courtroom setting. because this is all the positive side of it is you can basically shape your memories to be happier. I mean, I find this in myself. Maybe you could speak to that. If I, looking at past relationships, if I just think about or maybe speak to others about the positive things, really just think like I focus my mind on the positive memories, and then everything just becomes more positive. And I think it makes me feel like I'm way happier about my past. So there must be something to that because I almost start to forget that the negative stuff happened. And then the same thing on the flip side is if you focus on the negative, then the negative stuff just overpowers everything else. And you have a very heavy negative feeling about your past. So that seems like the way to live a healthy life, a happy life is just to focus on the positive, not to sound cliche, but like basically modifying your memories continuously that everything was just great. Is there something to that?
Well, the essence of that is right. There is something called state-dependent memory, which is that you're more likely to remember things that were consolidated or created as memories if they match the state that you're in now. So if you are sad now and your brain's sort of just going, you're more likely to remember other sad times because your memory and the emotional state of your brain is basically already activating those networks of sadness. And it's like, here's some other sad things and shitty things that happened to you. And it's the same with if you're embarrassed. That's the sort of classic one that we usually use as memory researchers, is that moment where you do something embarrassing and for the next 6 hours all you're thinking of is all the other embarrassing things you've ever done. And it's like your brain is like, would you like some other embarrassing stories? And obviously you're going, no, thank you. Please stop. But you have this spreading activation, as it's called, of just these synapses just like lighting up new networks. And you're going, and there's this other memory that's attached to the same feeling. And so it's the same with happiness, is that people who are happier tend to remember more happy memories. And so most of the time, unless you're depressed, most people look back at their lives with this sort of rosy reminiscence bias, and they're more likely to remember the positives than the negatives. But it's not quite the way you were describing it, actually. So it's not quite that you only remember the objectively good things that happened. It's more that your interpretation of the things that you've experienced is either neutral or positive. So for me, for example, growing up with my father with paranoid schizophrenia, that is something that I see as a net positive. So obviously at the time it was experienced in a complicated way, but in hindsight, it defined my life and it completely gave me a perspective of the human mind that I just wouldn't have had otherwise. And so I see that as a positive part of my autobiography. And that is what good therapy should be doing, is it should be taking negative experiences and not overwriting them or changing them. I mean, our brains do that naturally anyway. But trying to work with what you've got, the experiences, the true experiences, but then just shifting the emotional content so that how you're dealing with them now is good.
How much of what this Danny Kahneman type of idea that we live a lot of our life in memory, like it's not there's the direct in the moment experience of a thing, and then there's remembering that thing over and over and over and over. So there's like, I don't know, getting married or whatever, like some pleasant thing that if you over a lifetime, the pleasure you derive from that thing is disproportionately. Most of it is from remembering the thing versus experiencing it. Is there something to that?
I think so. And his experiments where he asked participants if they were offered this holiday that they could go on,
Mm-hmm.
but they wouldn't remember it. So they'd have the present day experience of enjoyment on this holiday. I think it was a tropical vacation or something that he'd
That's
offered
right.
people. And he then said, well, but you're not going to be able to remember this. Would you still go? And a lot of people say, no, I wouldn't go on that holiday if I can't remember it. I think that's interesting. And I think that sort of Pixar didn't happen. Sort of the social media generation obviously is perhaps even more in line with that also in terms of how you deal with that in social context, sort of sharing those memories with others and those experiences and which experiences end up being the important ones in our lives.
Yeah, there's a real case to be made. There's this kind of ridiculous thing that happens now. Whenever something cool is happening, people take out their phones and film it. But the case for that is that, yeah, this gives you actual something to look back at, that it's worthwhile to take a picture, actually.
Although it's even more worthwhile to pay attention. So attention is the glue between reality and memory. And so if you're using your phone to not have to pay attention and not have to put any work into remembering it, then you're going to look at that picture later and go, what was this? Because you've tried to outsource it in a way that our brains don't work.
How hard is it to modify memories from a neuroscience perspective? So if you look at brain-computer interfaces like Neuralink, for example, do you think there's a future where we're implanting or modifying memories directly?
Yeah. I mean, that's basically what we do as human beings already. And I don't see why tech couldn't do exactly the same
To,
thing.
to speed that up. So right now we could do that with language, right?
Yeah.
We just talk to each other and modify them, and we just speed that up.
Language, but also think about it yourself. So you can, it's called auto-suggestion, when you suggest things to yourself that didn't happen. And that often comes from reading something or seeing something or thinking about something or hearing somebody else's story and going, does something like that happen to me? And then you start picturing it and thinking about it in what context it could have. And then you start to basically implant a false memory in yourself. And so that can happen as well. And I think with things like Neuralink, it would be the same, where you'd have the ability to do that. But again, I still think that this interaction between humans and AI or AI-like systems is the same as a social interaction, which is why I was saying it's so important. I think that we have social psychologists in the room, because ultimately, whether it's an AI or another person, it's the same brain that you're modifying.
So what you're worried about there is that you become untethered from reality, like you fabricate too many details about the memory. Like if human is interacting with AI and AI is telling the human what they want to hear, are you worried about over time you start to just have a very overly modified version of your past narrative?
I'm not necessarily worried about the fact that AI and generative AI can create false memories. That is, again, something we've also been doing for a long time. Like modified photos is something pre-AI that we had that was already messing with people's minds. Even just what you have in the frame of a shot. So if you take a holiday snap and you're omitting like a really important part of what actually happened on that holiday because you're taking a picture of the nicest part and not the garbage behind you.
Yeah.
That is going to have an impact on your memory as well. And so versions of that have always existed. And historically, if you go even further back, I mean, in some ways, we've never been closer to facts than we are now. There's this whole idea of like, oh, we're living in this post-truth or blah, blah, blah. But that is not true. I mean, we didn't even know how to write for a long time. We had no way of reliably cataloging information, never mind the scientific method, never mind reliably sharing it with one another or fact-checking quickly with things like Google. So, I mean, we're so close to facts. But that, in some ways, I think is the worry is that we've gotten comfortable feeling like we can just access things that aren't modified or that are less likely to be modified, and now they're more likely to be. And that can interface with our memories.
So just on a practical, is there like a protocol for self-modifying memories so you can live a happier life?
There is, yeah. It's called cognitive restructuring. When you actively, deliberately change an aspect of a memory, usually for some therapeutic outcome, so to be happier, to be better in some way.
That's really interesting, right? Like not just for if you have some kind of issue, but just how to have a life well lived,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah, it totally works. I mean, I do it all the time. It's about thinking about experiences you've had, positive or negative. Usually the negative are the ones we need to work on more. And thinking instead of, wow, how terrible was that? Thinking, what did I learn from that? What has this given me that other people haven't experienced? What is it that it taught me about who are my friends? What are these insights that I've won from this experience? And so I think that is an important part of resilience that we ideally need to celebrate and teach more
That
than the opposite, which is hanging in the negatives.
that's probably really good for relationships too, right? Together you form the collective memory, and you work on that. You can just fabricate or modify towards the positive.
Well, with relationships, one of my favorite research on memories is that if you ask people in relationships who does most of the housework or who does most of certain things,
Sure.
the numbers that they give you, so like someone will say, I do 60%, the other person will say, I do 50%, and you add them up, That's more than 100%. And that's basically always the case. And on lots of different fronts, people will claim that they do more. And if you ask them how much their partner does, they will diminish it. And so, one of the tips I always say for relationships in terms of memories is actually just sharing what you're actually doing. And so if initially it feels a bit cumbersome because it's quite unnatural to be like, I've just taken out, the rubbish. I've just taken out the bins. Or I've just booked us a hotel. But saying it out loud means the other person's able to perceive it and then can add it to sort of their internal like star chart of how much you've done in the relationship. And they're more like to actually perceive what you're contributing. Whereas we just assume that people have the same memories we do. And that they of course she remembers that I took out the bins. But not necessarily. She might not even have really perceived it. But if you're reminding each other of all the things that you're doing, it can feel more balanced over time.
This memory is just so fascinating.